you want to continue running applications in the cloud the same way you run them in your data center? Let's say I would want to set up a Python application in my data center. I would first provision a virtual machine, then I would probably install my operating system, maybe then I would install Python, and then I would install the application and its dependencies. Do you want to continue running your applications the same way in the cloud as well? Or are there other approaches? To understand different approaches that cloud provides, you need to understand some of the terminology: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and a wide variety of other terminology. What we'll do in this specific section is to get on a quick journey to understand some of these terminology. Let's get started with a very, very important terminology, which is IaaS, or infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service is all about using only infrastructure from the cloud provider. For example, you make use of the VM service which is provided by the cloud platform to deploy your applications and databases. When you make use of infrastructure as a service, cloud provider is responsible for hardware, networking, and virtualization. So the hardware, the networking part of it, and the service you would need to virtualize this. For example, if you are making use of AWS, you can use the EC2 instance to create virtual machines. So that's the virtualization part. So hardware, networking, and virtualization is the responsibility of the cloud provider, and you are responsible for everything else. For example, let's consider I'm deploying a Python application on a Linux instance. I would be responsible for installing Linux. I would be responsible for installing Python. I would be responsible for installing the application as well. So you will be responsible for OS updates and patches. If I would need to do any upgrades to Linux, I would be responsible for that. I would be responsible for application code and runtime, the code and the runtime. For example, if it's a Python application, Python. If it's Java application, Java. If it's a Node.js application, then Node.js. You are responsible for all these things as well. You're also responsible for configuring load balancing. You might have millions of users on your applications. In that case, just having one VM instance is not sufficient. You'd want to have multiple VM instances, and you'd want to be able to load balance between them. When you're using infrastructure as a service, you are responsible for configuring load balancing. You are also responsible for auto scaling. The number of users on your application varies with time. And if I have a lot of users, then I would need a lot of instances. However, if I have less number of users, I would want to reduce the number of instances. This is what is called auto scaling. When you're using infrastructure as a service, you are also responsible for auto scaling the number of instances of your application based on the load which is coming in. And you are also responsible for availability. Some of these instances might have crashed. You'd want to be able to detect that, and you would want to replace it with an healthy instance. That would ensure that your application is highly available. When you're using infrastructure as a service, you are also responsible for availability. So infrastructure as a service is all about only making use of the infrastructure from the cloud provider. The cloud provider is only responsible for hardware, networking, and the virtualization software. That's all. The rest of the things related to your OS upgrades and patches, your application runtime, your application, load balancing, auto scaling, availability, all these become your responsibility. Now, the question you might be wondering is, how can we give some of these responsibilities to the cloud provider? The alternative to infrastructure as a service is something called platform as a service. Use a platform which is provided by the cloud. Let's consider an example. Let's say I would want to deploy a Python application. If I'm making use of a platform as a service, all that I would need to do is to tell the service, hey, this is my Python code, and I would want Python 3. Go ahead and run it. That's it. You're not responsible for installing the OS or installing Python or anything of that kind. You are only responsible for the code of your application. So when you're using platform as a service, the cloud provider is responsible for hardware, networking, and virtualization. This is exactly the same as infrastructure as a service as well. In addition, the cloud provider is also responsible for OS, installing the right OS, including upgrades and patches. The cloud provider is also responsible for installing the application runtime, installing the right version of Python or Node.js or Java. Cloud provider is also responsible for auto scaling, availability, and load balancing. All that you are responsible for is to configure the services in the right way, and you are also responsible for providing the right code. So if you'd want to deploy a Python application using platform as a service, all that you will be responsible for is the configuration and your Python code. All the rest of the things become the responsibility of a cloud provider. Let's look at a few examples. Let's start with compute options. These are basically options that help you to run Python applications, Java applications, or Node.js applications in the cloud. If you are using AWS, then AWS Elastic Beanstalk is a good example of platform as a service. When you're using AWS Elastic Beanstalk, all that you need to say is, this is the code I would want to deploy, and I would want to make use of Java 10 or Java 18. That's all. Everything else is taken care of by Elastic Beanstalk for you. Similar services are provided in Azure and Google Cloud by Azure App Service and Google App Engine respectively. Now, is platform as a service restricted only to compute? Nope. You also have a variety of relational and NoSQL databases as well. Good example of a relational transactional database in AWS is Amazon RDS, or the relational database service. In Google Cloud SQL is a good example. Azure SQL Database is a good example of a platform as a service database offering in Azure. Platform as a service offerings are not just restricted to compute and databases. You have platform as a service offerings in each of the cloud platforms with respect to queues, artificial intelligence, machine learning, analytics, operations, DevOps, and a lot of other things. The important takeaway from this step is, when you're going to the cloud, you'd want to prefer going for platform as a service. When you're making use of the platform as a service offerings from the cloud platforms, you are reducing your responsibilities. You will no longer be responsible for operating system, application runtime, auto scaling, availability, and load balancing. I'm sure you're having a wonderful time, and I'll see you in the next step.